It's impossible to predict cultural touchstones. In 1973, the Bowery in New York City was a neighborhood in the midst of a lengthy decline. Blasted by poverty and crime, it wasn't a place that attracted tourists, and it was probably the last spot you'd suspect to see music history being made. And 315 Bowery was an even less likely spot. The former site of a rowdy biker bar was small, dark, and in poor repair even then. And yet when Hilly Kristal shuttered his previous business, Hilly's on the Bowery, and re-christened it CBGB, it turned out to be the final ingredient in what would become one of the most important events in modern music. CBGB was the diviest of dive bars, but a magical combination of factors conspired to make it a legendary venue, a place where some of the most famous musicians of the past half-century debuted, and where some of the most legendary live performances of all time occurred. For more than 30 years, CBGB was shorthand for a cutting-edge music scene that was unpredictable, a little dangerous, and almost certainly unhygienic. That also made the club emblematic of New York City itself. As the city changed and cleaned itself up, the club struggled to fit in with a more sanitary, less rowdy neighborhood. So here's the untold truth of CBGB. CBGB's founder was an old pro. By the time Hilly Kristal opened CBGB, he'd been a fixture in the New York City music and restaurant scene for decades. According to Village Preservation, Kristal was born in New Jersey. He went to Settlement Music School in Philadelphia, served in the Marine Corps, and then worked as a professional singer in New York City. Hilly Kristal's singing career never quite took off, so he pivoted and began managing the legendary club Village Vanguard, booking some of the biggest names in jazz, like Miles Davis or John Coltrane. In 1966, Kristal opened his own restaurant Hilly's in the Village. Hilly's was about as far from the grimy punk scene that would define CBGB as you could get. It served French-style cuisine and booked musical acts like Bette Midler with a focus on standards and show tunes. As the New York Times notes, Kristal was a fan of a broad range of music, especially folk music. He kept a guitar near his desk at all times. Hilly Kristal had no idea he was launching a legend. When Kristal relaunched his struggling bar at 315 Bowery in New York City in 1972, he wanted to create a music venue that catered to the sort of artists he enjoyed. As Hilly Kristal himself makes clear, the name CBGB stood for country, bluegrass, and blues. According to Abandoned Spaces, in 1973, two locals, Bill Page and Rusty McKenna, persuaded Kristal to let them start booking local musical acts. The music scene in New York was evolving, and there weren't many venues available for the acts that would eventually be known as punk and new wave. As the New York Times reports, the legendary musician Patti Smith said, "There was no real venue in 1973 for people like us. We didn't fit into the cabarets or the folk clubs." The acts that Page and McKenna brought in didn't match Hilly's initial CBGB vision. In fact, as Fuse reports, one of the earliest acts to play the venue, Television, actually had to lie to Kristal and claim they played some country music in order to get the gig. According to The Advocate, he eventually added f.v.k to the bar's name, which stood for Other Music for Uplifting Gourmandizers. That other music would come to define the spot as the launching pad for punk rock in the 1970s. Hilly Kristal had two rules. CBGB quickly became an important part of New York's underground music scene. This was due to a number of factors, but one of the main reasons was simple: Hilly Kristal was kind of cheap. In fact, Kristal himself admits that the venue didn't initially guarantee that bands would get paid, though he gave them most of the door money to cover their expenses. As Village Preservation reports, Kristal had two basic rules for the bands that were booked to play CBGB. The first was that they had to load and unload their own equipment. Kristal didn't employ anyone to do that for the bands, and he wasn't about to do it himself. The second was that the bands could only play original music, no cover songs. While some people have painted the no covers rule as a dedication to originality and a keystone to punk's development as a musical form, Kristal's son Dana makes it clear in this interview with Tiny Mix Tapes that it was all about money. Kristal didn't want to pay American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers fees. These fees get charged anytime a copyrighted song is played in a venue, and they can be quite expensive. According to Consequence of Sound, some bands managed to get a cover or two in under Hilly Kristal's nose, but by and large the no covers rule held. CBGB became a talent incubator. Hilly Kristal's requirement that bands act as their own roadies and only play original music, no covers, may have been inspired by a desire to keep his costs low, but it made CBGB fertile ground for new music. As ultimate classic rock notes, in early 1970s New York City it was difficult for bands to find venues that would not only book unknown musicians but also allow them to play original music. When CBGB offered to do both, it removed many of the barriers that kept hungry young musicians from getting the gigs that were crucial to their musical development and building a fan base. As You Discover Music reports, legendary bands Television and the Ramones were some of the first groups to play CBGBs, and they had no following and wonky equipment that sometimes didn't work. But Kristal noted that these bands attracted other bands who needed a stage where they could get their music into the Being that venue where bands could get their start soon meant that CBGB hosted some legendary debuts. As diffuser notes, aside from Television and the Ramones, bands like the Beastie Boys, Patti Smith, Blondie and the Talking Heads graced the tiny stage at CBGB long before they had record deals or were household names.